Now we could go to some of these questions that people were raising before we started, which I probably haven't answered. Shall we repeat those or go back to them?
I think you touched on my question, but I'll ask it again, which was, again, in the very first pages of Industrial Dynamics, the idea that we have models in our heads, this notion of mental model, comes through very, very clearly and is at the foundation of the field. Even today, when you teach seminars with students or executives, the idea that we work through models and don't have direct contact with the real world is hard for people to internalize. I'm just wondering, A, how you came to that idea, and B, how it went over with some of your colleagues as you started to talk about it.
Well, I suppose I don't have a clear recollection of exactly the details of that, but I think basically it is from the fact that even the earliest of the system dynamics models came out of people's heads, out of talking to them. And also, pretty obvious that their decisions are being made on the basis of those assumptions and insights in their heads. Also very obvious that those mental models are not models of the real world. They differ between people. They differ in one person from one minute to the next, literally, as this conversation changes, the mental model that they're using shifts. And yet, clear that it's the mental models that are driving the world. And that system dynamics models coming out of those represent another way and a better way to organize that information. I think it was much later that the idea arose that one of the main purposes of system dynamics models is to alter the mental models. I don't think that there's any high likelihood that the output of a system dynamics model will lead to action unless it gets internalized in people's mental models, and unless they come to see it. And that in itself is an interesting process, because you can start with the mental models, you can draw out a system dynamics model that has very contrary results from what people had expected. And after they've been immersed in it a while, they begin to accept what's in the model, and then they will say, I believe that all the time. You didn't do anything new because I always believed it, in spite of the fact that they clearly had made the opposite assertions early on. This is a process, I would say, of making inroads into the mental models. And that's a process that's hard to evaluate, because you don't know the extent to which you've done it or the adequacy with which you have done it. But going back to our earlier discussion, maybe as many as 20 generic models that would cover most of management, I would say that if you had those, and if you had people that really understood them, then they would be quite aware that they are in fact facing a particular one and would have some clues as to what to do.
I had asked earlier about how you saw related areas of science, cybernetics, and some of the other similar threads to servo mechanisms and system dynamics develop or encounter difficulty as they developed alongside of system dynamics.
The field of cybernetics had its name well before the field of system dynamics. It had a name in the 40s, probably in the middle, maybe even the early 40s. It was a field that centered largely around Norbert Wiener, Rosenblith here at MIT, and a number of people in other places, including some key person in Mexico. And I think it was almost entirely devoted to medicine and psychology and things related to the medical world, I think. A famous book by Wiener, what was the cybernetic, maybe it's just cybernetics, has in it a number of insights, largely, some of them I think wrong with respect to social systems. That work was known, but it was a thread very different from the one that came out of engineering and out of servo mechanisms. And it was going on over there, and it had a small group. I don't think it got into simulation. I think it was largely conceptual discussion. It might have, in the simpler ones, had mathematical solutions to simple dynamics. But I don't think that it's had any great vitality continuing into the present day, as far as I know. What I see as a strength of system dynamics is that it has a pretty uniquely special organized foundation of ideas around the modeling. And we have software that disciplines those ideas. People have criticized the system dynamics software because it's not general purpose. There are a lot of things you can walk up to it and you can't do with the various system dynamic software. Stella, I think, PowerSim and FinSim, which most of us are using now. And instead of being a weakness, I look upon that as a strength. It disciplines you to do system dynamics correctly. It doesn't let you write the kinds of equations that are invalid. And so it's an implementation in many ways of the theory and the method. I mean, some people, going back to earlier discussion, may call the software a part of the methodology, but it's also, to some extent, a statement of the method, a statement of what system dynamics is. And I think in that sense has been rather powerful in influencing the way people look at systems. Dynamo was the first of those. Dynamo still, I believe, exists, still being updated, but it's not being pushed to the public. It's being used now more internally in the company where it's being developed, although it was pushed generally for a number of years.
Well, I started to ask before a little bit about this assertion that all actions are controlled through feedback. That's something that becomes fairly second nature to anybody who practices system dynamics for a little while. But I think it's a pretty bold assertion to the neophyte, so to speak. Have people challenged you in that assertion? How have you typically responded to that? It seems that it's almost been instinctive for you, but I suspect that much of the world doesn't see it that way.
I don't recall that there's been any major or organized debate around that question. Certainly there have been people who, faced with it, say, well, of course not, because there are other things. But when pressed, I think they have trouble coming up with examples. So I think we win that point by default as much as anything else among those that care or care to debate it. Now, those that have never been exposed to it probably obviously don't accept it. But I don't think it's one of the major problems faced in having system dynamics accepted. There are others that people stumble over, I think, more severely.
Yeah. I think it's somewhat closely tied to this question about inclusion of soft variables. Because sometimes the reason we go searching for those soft variables is that we know there must be some feedback controlling an action, and if those variables are not ones that can be explained by the traditional hard ones, then we go looking for softer variables. So maybe that's where that rears its ugly head in terms of people's reluctance to want to do that. I sometimes get the sense that it isn't so much that people react to the quantitative aspect of things, but that they get very nervous when we force them to be explicit in their own policies, because it takes away people's, shall we say, wiggle room, the ability to say, no, that's not really the way it happens. And so maybe it isn't the feedback loop assertion as much as it is that when we actually try to model that and use soft variables, we run into trouble. Are there some examples that come to your mind of specific sort of negative reactions to the inclusion of soft variables?
I'll ask that more specifically. You said when you joined the board of the young computer company that you built the model for your own understanding. Did you share it?
I tried to share it.
And?
There are two ways of using models. Many ways, I suppose, but two rather poor ways. One is to get people to accept the model, understand it, follow it. The other extreme way is not to even tell them you have a model, but use the results for your own guidance. Now, in Digital Equipment Corporation, it was intermediate between those two. I tried to get them to take an interest in system dynamics. I tried to get them to understand that this would be a good way to understand what they were doing. They steadfastly refused to accept that. They said, look, you can't possibly understand what we learn by experience and intuition. We don't believe this is possible. On the other hand, I had an unusually powerful position for an outside director because the power was equally divided on the board between the investors and those who knew what it was all about, namely the subject matter and what the corporation was doing. And so, if they disagreed, as they often did, if I had a persuasive argument, it usually would go that way. And I assert I was getting those persuasive arguments out of the modeling I was doing. At one stage, this came to something of a head in a board meeting, and the president, when I was again pushing them to maybe have some people engage in system dynamics and carry on the modeling in the company, he said, you can't possibly do that. We know that you can't incorporate these personal experience variables. We agree that we've been following the advice that you've been giving, and we agree that it's been very successful, but it's not because of your modeling, it's just because you're a better manager than we are. Now, you see, that excused them from having to think about the approach. And one interesting sidelight, one of the things that came out of that model, out of the 250 variables, there were really two rules of thumb that came out, and that was the market is huge, the orders will come in if you can supply them, the demand is great, it's not a cutthroat pricing situation at that time, may not be as much so even now as people think, but at that time, the prices in the market for computers having the same catalog specifications varied over a price range of 10 to 1. Wow. And who had the highest priced computers? IBM. Who had the largest market share? IBM. So much for Economics 101. Because IBM was not just selling computers, they were selling security to vice presidents, the most insecure level in the corporation. And they were, and everybody knew that if you had trouble with an IBM computer, the company would bail you out some way. And so we had this huge range of prices and a tendency for newcomers to try to undercut prices down at the bottom. So basically two things. Keep the price up. I think the modeling kept the prices twice as high as they otherwise would have been. And the money was used to expand whether you had business or not. And the first big episode of this was when one floor of the old mill buildings was going to be vacated. And the question, should this new small company rent the space? It was many, many times the space that they then occupied, but it wasn't sure that you could get that space in the future if you needed it. And I took the position that yes, they should go ahead and rent it. And eventually, after a board meeting or two, that decision was made, and the board meeting after that was held in the new space. We walked into one floor as big as 2 football fields. You stand in the middle and you can hardly see the windows at the opposite ends. Within 9 months, it was absolutely full of people turning out product that was returning 15% net after taxes. And over the years, during the 3-4 decades that Digital Equipment was a remarkably successful company, they were in some ways a real estate company. They bought every shopping center that became available. They bought every abandoned building or any building that people were giving up. They had buildings all over New England just because they became available. And they filled them with people turning out product now. They ran into difficulty for an entirely different set of reasons and perhaps for not carrying on modeling, but that's a separate story. That's a separate story of why they ran into later difficulty.